Your presenter is Margie Kerr, a sociologist and author who teaches at the University of Pittsburgh. She serves as a consultant for Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site and is the author of Scream: Chilling Adventures in the Science of Fear.
I knew pretty early in life that I was a thrill seeker. I loved watching scary movies, riding my horse bareback, and making sure I was the first in line for the scariest roller coasters. And I loved haunted houses, celebrating Halloween, which was, in my opinion, and still is, the best holiday. Because it was all about dressing up, hanging out with friends, fighting monsters and summoning ghosts, and, of course, candy. In the context of adventure and even a little bit of danger, fear for me is fun. As a sociologist, however, I also became acutely aware that fear has some serious downsides. Our panic, anxiety, worry, and fears are shaped by culture and can become the dominant emotions behind a majority of our actions and decisions, often to our great detriment. I learned, and you will too, the role fear plays in driving deep divides between people, and how those with less than good intentions use fear tactics to motivate action in groups of people. Through this lens, I viewed fear as a toxic, destructive force, and defeating it, I thought, was the key to positive change. That all changed in the fall of 2008. I was in the thick of finishing my dissertation, working a full-time job in research at the Veterans Hospital, and completely stressed out. One Friday evening, I called a friend and said I have got to do something fun, something that would make it impossible to think about work or school. The answer, as it has been for me since childhood, was to go to a haunted house. Standing in line, full of excited anticipation, I couldn't wait to jump and scream. And I remember looking around at the hundreds of other people standing in line, all who had, like me, decided it was worth dedicating time and money to get scared. And in that moment, I realized I had missed a big part of the story about fear. Lots of people enjoy fear. They love screaming their heads off, and they proudly post pictures of their terrifying adventures on social media. They exit haunted houses, thrill rides, and horror movies, smiling, laughing, hugging, and giving each other high fives. But why? Fear is one of the negative emotions to be avoided at all costs, right? Letting go of everything I thought I knew about fear, my questions started piling up. Some of them fun, like what's the difference between physical thrills from riding a roller coaster and psychological chills from being alone in the dark? And why do some people like haunted houses and others don't? But I had more serious questions too, like how do our fears change over time and place? How do they reflect the economic, cultural, and political challenges of a moment? How does culture shape how we express fear? Why, in a world where people perceive themselves to be in ever greater danger, are we seeking out even more fear-inciting recreation in record numbers? And what can we learn from engaging in frightful activities? I set out to answer these questions, and over the past 10 years, I've traveled around the world, from Japan to South America, Canada, and all over the U.S., researching fear and doing as many thrilling and scary things as I could in order to understand fear from every angle. And now I'm here to share all that I've learned with you. The foundation of this course is built on scientific research from leading experts in history, sociology, psychology, and across academic disciplines. Throughout these lessons, I'll cover the vast landscape of the science and study of fear, from the neurophysiological foundations, or what is happening in our brain and body, to the sociological and historical components. I'll investigate how the political, economic, and sociocultural context informs what we fear, who is feared, and how fear is managed in any given time and place. And I'll share findings from my own research conducted with cognitive neuroscientist Greg Siegel at the University of Pittsburgh. For 2 years, we set up a mobile lab in the basement of a haunted attraction and collected survey data, physiological data like heart rate and skin conductance, and even electroencephalography, or EEG, from guests before and after going through an extreme haunted attraction. The data we collected from over 300 research participants offers a great deal of insight into why people choose to engage with scary material, including how it changes the way we feel and the way our brain processes information. I'll also explore what surveys suggest are our biggest fears in the U.S. today, from corrupt politicians, climate change, and cybercrime, to invasions from outer space or supernatural elements. Finally, I'll cover what researchers and clinicians have found to be the most effective ways to manage and overcome our fears, and to build a better, healthier relationship with fear so that it does what it's designed to do: help us stay alive. To get started on this adventure into all things fear, we have to ask, what exactly is fear? Is it a pulse over 100 beats per minute? Is it goosebumps down the spine and shaky hands? And what's the difference between fear and anxiety, between the urge to hide under a blanket and wanting to run for the nearest weapon? Or is fear simply whatever response we have to something that we think is, well, scary? The answers to these questions often depend on who you're asking: a sociologist, a historian, a neuroscientist, a psychologist. When you do, as I have, you quickly discover that fear is actually a pretty tough concept to define. It's one of those concepts that everyone intuitively understands, but when you actually sit down and try to define it, you quickly realize just how complex this concept is. But definitions are important, and science has come a long way in terms of interdisciplinary cooperation. This means that researchers need to be able to communicate across disciplines, compare findings, and replicate research. This is especially important when we're talking about a concept as layered and powerful as fear. So defining fear is important. In fact, it's critical. How do we do that, though, when so much about fear is tied to context, culture, time, and place? Well, let's start with what is universally shared among us, namely the human body and the threat response, more commonly known as fight or flight. To break down what happens in the brain and body during this sophisticated, highly evolved, life-saving response, I'll share an experience that to this day continues to be in the top 5 most terrifying moments of my life: my walk around the edge of the CN Tower in Toronto, Canada. The Edge Walk, billed by the Guinness Book of World Records in 2011 as the world's highest external walk on a building, takes guests up 116 stories to walk around the outside of the observation deck on a 5-foot wide metal grate with no guardrail. Guests, like me, are strapped into a sliding trolley track that circles the outside of the tower so we can walk and lean over the side hands-free. The 1,815.4-foot tall CN Tower opened in 1976, and it has broken numerous world records and received many notable awards. It held the title for tallest freestanding structure in the world until 2010, and is also listed as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Today, it is primarily known as a tourist attraction with over 2 million visitors a year. The Edge Walk is just one of the many growing opportunities to test our courage and scare the heck out of us. Other examples include bungee jumping, skydiving, high-line ropes courses, and the ever-expanding world of extreme sports. And while interest in these activities is growing exponentially today, people have been jumping out of and hanging off tall structures for thousands of years, though often with a very different purpose than just for the thrill of it. In fact, the concept of parachuting dates back to 12th century China. And for centuries, men on Pentecost Islands in Vanuatu have jumped headfirst from tall wooden platforms with vines tied around their ankles. Motivations behind these death-defying feats vary by time and place. But one thing remains true. All of these experiences launch our body into what I call go mode, or fight or flight. Extreme experiences like these activate our threat response through flipping, flinging, twisting, turning, and throwing us around in ways the human body really wasn't designed to handle. I never considered myself afraid of heights, so I was truly shocked at the way my body responded as soon as I set foot on the edge walk. When I stepped out onto the 5-foot wide metal grate, I couldn't help but look down, and in that moment, my body felt frozen and refused to move. Yet, at the same time, my heart was racing, and I started to sweat profusely. I remember whispering, "Oh my gosh," and I swear I even stopped breathing. I felt dizzy and disoriented. I felt a growing pressure on my temples, and I could hear my heartbeat loudly in my ears. Why was I so scared? Rationally, logically, I knew I was completely safe. First, the obvious. A healthy fear of heights is normal. After all, we can't fly. And due to our uniquely human genetic blueprint, more on that in a later lesson, all of us will experience height-related physiological changes. But only 3 to 5% of the population will experience acrophobia, which is the pathological fear of heights, meaning the fear is such that it significantly disrupts a person's ability to function in their everyday life. Greek, Roman, and Chinese antiquity is full of descriptions of the consequences of high heights, like poor eyesight, dizziness, and a great description found in the Greek Corpus Hippocraticum in the 5th century BC, a slackening of the muscles of the entire body. I certainly felt these changes, and so much more, all of which can be traced to our sympathetic nervous system's automatic response to real or even just perceived threat. But, and I'll repeat this often, our physical response to threat is not synonymous with fear. Let's take a closer look. This human body of ours is incredibly adaptive and can do many things, but it can't do everything, like fly, and it certainly is not impervious to damage. Considering the many, many dangers in this world, it's often a wonder our vulnerable bodies have managed to survive this long. And that is thanks to our automatic response to threat, sometimes referred to as our defensive response. Our body's automatic physiological response to threat is complex and has evolved over the millennia, helping to keep us alive. And not just us. Every organism, from the fruit fly to the grizzly bear, has a defense or threat response. It's one of our survival circuits. Other survival circuits are those responsible for ensuring we're regulating our resources. In other words, eating, balancing our fluids, thermoregulation, and of course, reproduction. Because the threat response is so complex and involves a lot of different systems working together, and because, as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure researchers are talking about the same thing, the National Institute of Mental Health has introduced guidelines that break down the concept of fear, along with many other big emotion concepts, into specific domains. This set of guidelines is collectively referred to as the Research Domain Criteria, or RDoC. The RDoC offers a way of organizing the many dimensions of functioning that, as they write, span the full range of human behavior from normal to abnormal. It is not a diagnostic guide, but an attempt to understand mental health and emotions in a more comprehensive, but also organized manner. The RDoC consists of a matrix of 6 research domains built around our systems of emotion, cognition, motivation, and social behavior. Each domain is further divided into constructs that identify behavioral responses, neural mechanisms, and a range of processes that are related to different aspects of human functioning. When it comes to understanding our threat response, we look to the constructs in what is called the negative valence domain. In the RDoC, the domain of negative valence systems divides affective states into the following constructs: acute threat, or fear, potential threat, or anxiety, sustained threat, loss, and frustrative non-reward. Don't worry, we're not going to be working through the entire matrix, but I want to point out that when we talk about fear, we have to be really specific about what exactly is being discussed. In this lesson, I'm focusing on the acute threat construct and our automatic threat response. To understand that, and my own overwhelming experience on the CN Tower, we have to start with our nervous system. Very broadly, our nervous system is the network of systems tasked with keeping us alive, specifically regulating and controlling everything from the skin in and attempting to control as much as possible from the skin out. Our nervous system is responsible for processing sensory input, so what we see, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Integrating and processing information like connecting the smell of fresh baked apple pie and fond memories from childhood. And motor output, things like sending out signals that allow us to reach out and cut a big slice of that apple pie. Our nervous system is organized structurally into the central nervous system, or CNS, which includes our brain, cerebellum, and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, which includes clusters of nerve cell bodies from which nerve tracts extend out into every part of our body, innervating or supplying nerves for signaling to our muscles, organs, and tissue. Our nervous system communicates through neurons and glial cells. Our billions of neurons are organized into enormous, complex, interconnected networks. Scientists estimate that our neuronal network is made up of between 100 and 1,000 trillion synaptic connections. Communication between this inconceivably vast horde of neurons is what allows us to function. Neurons come in all shapes and sizes and have processing arms called axons and dendrites, which extend from the cell body and form connections with other neurons. Axons extend far from the cell body. For example, motor neurons at the base of the spinal cord have axons that stretch as long as 3 feet. The axons of many neurons are bundled together, forming the rope-like constructions better known as nerve tracts. Dendrites are the spiky, branch-like structures off the main cell body. They extend outward, reaching for information in the immediate vicinity of the neuron. The junctions between two neurons are called synapses. Each neuron can have upwards of 10,000 synaptic connections to other neurons and to non-neuronal elements, such as skeletal muscle fibers and hormone-producing glands, such as the pancreas and ovaries. Neurons communicate through electrical and chemical signaling using neurotransmitters. These are uniquely designed endogenous chemicals that bind with specialized receptors located on a neuron's membrane that are responsive to specific types of activities and stimuli. They work kind of like one of those puzzles where you push the shape through the correctly shaped hole, the star through the star hole, the oval through the oval hole, that sort of thing. This vast network of neurons is further organized into the somatic system, which is responsible for voluntary movement and relaying sensory information, and our autonomic systems, which control involuntary body functions. The autonomic nervous system is the one I'm going to focus on today, and it can be further organized into the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. The sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, is the one primarily responsible for our fight or flight or threat response. But that's not all. Our SNS actually prepares us for all stress, basically anything that is going to tax our body's resources. Together, the SNS and PNS, or more specifically, the networks of interconnected neurons, work together at lightning speed. We're talking about 270 miles an hour from the spinal cord to our muscles, and without our conscious awareness, to monitor and regulate our body with the goal of survival and efficiency. In the face of real or perceived threat, and without our conscious awareness, the sympathetic nervous system responds immediately, increasing the circulation throughout the brain and body of a cascade of hormones and neurotransmitters designed to aid in fueling and preparing us to face threats. These chemical changes increase our heart rate, sweat production, respiration, and even our pupils dilate. Acute threat is also often associated with changes in pain sensitivity, facial expressions, and of course, approach or avoidance behaviors, like running away from a roaring bear or charging forward in fight mode. These all fall under the behavioral category in the RDoC that we can measure in the lab to gain insight into a person's response to threat. Standing on the side of the 116-floor tower, I experienced all of these powerful changes in a matter of seconds. Yet, this overwhelming fight or flight response on the edge walk was happening as I was standing stone still, strapped safely into a harness that could support an elephant, or so I was told. So really, where was the threat?
It's awesome.
For starters, standing 116 stories high, gazing out across the city of Toronto, I lost my sense of where my body was in space, which is called proprioception. Just like other sensory systems are designed to process information from the outside world, like sound, sight, touch, smell, and taste, with specialized receptors, our proprioceptive system is designed to sense whether we're up or down, moving fast or slow. External and internal sensory cues are combined and processed together, giving us our sense of balance. A critical contribution to maintaining balance comes from our ocular receptors. In other words, what we're looking at. There's a reason why walking a straight line with our eyes closed is such a challenge. Basically, to feel stable in our bodies, we calculate the distance between where our body is in relation to stationary objects, like the ground. When the closest stationary object is too far away, we have nothing to use as a reference point to maintain balance, raising red flags and launching us into panic. Thinking back to my experience on the CN Tower, I shockingly was having a hard time telling up from down and left from right. I had no sense of balance, my legs were shaking uncontrollably, and I couldn't even think straight. I remember trying my hardest to listen to what our guide was saying, but not being able to process any of the words. I know now that this is because part of our response to threat is a reprioritization of attention. Essentially, critical and abstract thought takes a backseat to all of our systems that are working to make sure we survive. Because I had yet to move, and noticing the no doubt dumbfounded look on my face, the guide came over to me and suggested that instead of looking down or out, I turn around and focus on the building right in front of me, something close to me and static that I could orient myself to. And it worked. I was able to take some deep breaths, listen to the guide, and eventually join the other edge walkers in completing the different stunts, like hanging over the side of the building. But it was still terrifying. I'll never forget the first stunt. We simply had to lean back over the edge. No big deal, right? Wrong. I could only take the tiniest steps on my shaking legs and slowly push myself backwards until my heels were over the edge. I looked down and took a breath and kept pushing out until my entire body was hanging by a rope 116 stories off the ground. This was truly the most terrifying experience I had ever had. And when I watched the video of this after the fact, I could not believe that I was smiling. And I wasn't the only one. And this brings us back to the critical distinction between our threat response, what is automatically happening in our body, and the emotional experience of fear. While the threat response is universal, the shape it takes, the degree of increased activity in the SNS, along with the meaning we make of those changes, varies widely from person to person. For example, I observed a wide range of reactions among my fellow edge walkers. Some, like me, struggled to even move. Others confidently walked to the edge, and there was one walker who fearlessly threw her body over the side. her heels dangerously close to slipping with arms outstretched.
You got it.
When we reached the south side of the tower, about 40 minutes since that first step, I could walk to the edge and lean out into my best Supergirl pose. I wasn't falling, I was flying. I felt euphoric, and I could tell everyone from my group did as well as they screamed and laughed. By the time we all got back down to the ground, I felt amazing. All the mental chatter in my brain had stopped, and I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. This was likely related to increasing activity in the PNS, which was working to bring my body back down to a less excited state. Adrenaline and norepinephrine have a worldwide reputation for being a part of moments like this, the natural high of the thrill. But really, they are only one small part of what can produce the positive feelings associated with these experiences. Our emotional experiences are complex, and no one hormone or neurochemical is solely responsible for how we feel. The threat response is only one component, and not even a necessary one, associated with feeling afraid. But it is an important one, and by breaking out the constructs in the negative valence domain and studying components independently and in relation to other components, we can begin to understand how automatic reactions of the body might contribute to experiencing more or less fear. And critically, we are able to better identify what might be happening to contribute to disorders associated with the negative valence constructs like anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder, both of which can be characterized by a more vigilant or highly active sympathetic nervous system. The edge walk was an experience like no other, and unlike a roller coaster that lasts only a few minutes, I had a good half hour of experiencing high thrill and intensity. My sympathetic nervous system propelled my body into a powerful threat response, driving up my heart rate, increasing my breathing, shutting down my critical thought, and leaving me feeling unstable and, well, terrified. But my fear and uncertainty gave way to feelings of empowerment, of superhero strength, and ultimately a stronger sense of self-competence. While I walked away feeling like a superhero that day, I've also walked away from terrifying encounters feeling very much the opposite. As I'll explore across these lessons, there is a lot to be afraid of in our world today. Climate change, cybercrime, corrupt politicians, pandemics, and these fears can powerfully impact people's lives. One of the best ways to tackle the challenges of these downsides of fear is through learning about and embracing the upsides. And although there are many things to fear, there are also many ways to manage, overcome, and dare I say, even have fun with fear.